David writes, a related assumption occurs in the so-called simulation argument, whose most cogent proponent is the philosopher Nick Bostrom. Its premise is that in the distant future, the whole universe as we know it is going to be simulated in computers, perhaps for scientific or historical research. Many times, perhaps infinitely many times. Therefore, virtually all instances of us are in those simulations and not in the original world. And therefore, we are almost certainly living in a simulation. So the argument goes. But is it really valid to equate most instances with near certainty like that? For an inkling of why it might not be, consider a thought experiment. Imagine that physicists discover that space is actually many-layered like puff pastry. The number of layers varies from place to place. The layers split in some places and their contents split with them. Every layer has identical contents though. Hence, although we do not feel it, instances of us split and merge as we move around. Suppose that in London, space has 1 million layers, while in Oxford it only has 1. I travel frequently between the two cities, and one day I wake up from having forgotten which one I am in. It is dark. Should I bet I am much more likely to be in London, just because 1 million times as many instances of me ever wake up in London as in Oxford? I think not. In that situation, it is clear that counting the number of instances of oneself is no guide to the probability one ought to use in decision making. We should be counting histories, not instances. In quantum theory, the laws of physics tell us how to count histories by measure. In the case of multiple simulations, I know of no good argument for any way of counting them. It is an open question, but I do not see why repeating the same simulation of me 1 million times should in any sense make it more likely that I am a simulation rather than the original. What if one computer uses 1 million times as many electrons as another to represent each bit of information in its memory? Am I more likely to be in the former computer than in the latter? A different issue raised by the simulation argument is this. Will the universe as we know it really be simulated often in the future? Would that not be immoral? The world as it exists today contains an enormous amount of suffering, and whoever ran such a simulation would be responsible for recreating it. Or would they? Are two identical instances of a quale the same thing as one? If so, then creating the simulation would not be immoral. No more than reading a book about past suffering is immoral. But in that case, how different do two simulations of people have to be before they count as two people for moral purposes again? Again, I know of no good answer to these questions. I suspect that they will be answered only by the explanatory theory from which AI will also follow. Pause there, my reflection on that. Yes, so David has mentioned this before all the way back in A Window on Infinity, in an earlier chapter. The problem with trying to count infinities. And that if you have these universes with different physical laws, you have an uncountable infinity. And if you're thinking of this fractal type situation, where in the distant future there's going to be civilizations that will have computers in which there'll be simulations of people who have computers in which there are going to be simulations and so on and so on and so on, just fractally expanding out. There's no way of counting these, and so we don't even know what the nature of consciousness is either. And by the way, our best understanding of physical reality that we occupy right now, as we've already said, is that you are infinitely many fungible instances already, which can't be counted, and so in what sense are those more numerous than you? What if, like David's giving a hint here, if the simulated versions of you are not infinitely many fungible instances, but are based upon some other kind of simulation of the laws of physics which nevertheless allow for conscious experience? Well, we've done experiments here to show that we live in a universe that is governed by the laws of quantum theory, which mean that you as a person aren't a single instance. But maybe those simulated, the most efficient way of simulating people in those computers is single instance people. Maybe that's it. Don't know. But we know that we're not single instance people. We're uncountably infinitely many. So maybe we already outnumber even that number of infinitely many people being simulated. I wonder why, well, he wouldn't have known. Nick Bostrom didn't take into account this idea of the multiverse already, that we live in a multiverse. Not many people take the multiverse seriously enough. And philosophers should, analytic philosophers should.